The Rainbow Maniac was a serial killer that was active in Brazil during 2007 and 2008. And it's always fascinated me because the dude's never been caught. So this all takes place in a park called Piturius Park. And the reason why they called this serial killer the Rainbow Maniac is he would unalive gay people in these parks. So he did this to 12 people, and because he wasn't detected for so long, people assumed that he must have been part of the police force. And they also believe that the gun used during these unalivings were that of a common police officers. So eventually they arrested this guy named Jairo Francisco Franco. He's somehow named after a Spanish dictator, I don't really know why. And he eventually gets put on trial. However, they find him non-guilty. But I think the most interesting part was one of the gay people that was unalived in the park was, banged 12 times. A witness saw him banging 12 times. But yeah, ever since then, they found this guy non-guilty. They just haven't had another suspect since. And 2008 till now, not a single lead has been made.
My name is Takahiro Shiraishi. Between August and October 2017, I committed a series of murders that shocked Japan. I began by stalking Twitter, looking for young women sharing suicidal thoughts. I then contacted them and asked if I could watch or assist them with taking their own life. After convincing them to meet, I would eventually strangle them and dismember them. Police discovered me while investigating the disappearance of 23-year-old Eiko Tamura. They used Twitter to lure me into a fake meeting. When they entered my apartment, they discovered the heads of all 9 of my victims, stored in freezers. My 9 victims were 8 women and 1 man, all of whom were between the ages of 15 to 26. 3 of them were still in high school. On October 1st, 2020, I pled guilty to 9 murders, and on December 15th, I was sentenced to death. My case raised serious questions among the Japanese public about how to safeguard young people on social media. I am currently awaiting execution.
My name is Lonnie David Franklin Jr. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles before joining the United States Army. I was given a dishonorable discharge following my release from prison after being convicted of gang raping a 17-year-old girl in Stuttgart, West Germany in 1975. In the mid-1980s, the LAPD became aware of a possible serial killer targeting black women who were chronic drug users and street sex workers. While several of these crimes were linked to other serial killers of the time, 7 victims had been killed with the same gun. The cases remained unsolved for years. In 2007, Janecia Peters' body was found. DNA analysis linked her murder to 11 unsolved murders in Los Angeles, the first of which occurred in 1985. Detectives spent years searching DNA databases before identifying me as the perpetrator of at least 11 murders. I was arrested in 2010. Authorities discovered over 1,000 photos of women at my home, including hundreds of hours of video. I earned my nickname, the Grim Sleeper, because I took a 14-year break between my crimes, from 1988 to 2002. On June 6, 2016, a jury sentenced me to death. I was found dead in my jail cell on March 28, 2020. The cause and results of an autopsy were never publicly released.
The topic of mass kidnappings has always fascinated me. A mass kidnapping is when more than 5 people get kidnapped at once. So this guy right here named Frederick Woods just turned 70 and got released from a California prison. When he was 24, he kidnapped an entire school bus of kids, along with his 2 accomplices. So what they did is they hijacked a school bus and forced the bus driver to drive over 100 miles to a remote quarry. And they placed this van into the ground and basically put the kids and the bus driver inside. And they demanded a $5 million ransom for their release. And the conditions in here were really fucked. Like, they were forced to sleep on the ground basically, and they needed to poop inside a bucket. And not to mention, during that time it was summer in California, so they were basically being baked with their poop. And the only way these kids and the bus driver escaped is while the kidnappers were asleep, they somehow managed to dig their way out of the van and out of the ground, which is honestly pretty impressive in and of itself. But yeah, these people all serve their sentences and they're all free people. Apparently they haven't committed any crime since, probably because they're too old.
My name is Andre Rand. I spent 2 decades haunting the dreams of New York City children. My reign of terror began in July 1972, when 5-year-old Alice Pereira vanished from her apartment complex in Staten Island. Her body was never found, but I am the prime suspect, as I was working at the same apartment complex as a painter during her disappearance. I continued abducting and murdering young women for the next 14 years across Staten Island. I was arrested several times, but police did not have enough evidence to charge me each time. This changed in July 1987 when 12-year-old Jennifer Schweiger, born with Down syndrome, disappeared. She was last seen walking with me. Her body was discovered 35 days later, after an extensive search by law enforcement. I was charged with first-degree kidnapping in 1988 after a jury was unable to reach a verdict on murder, sentencing me to 25 years in prison. While in prison, I bragged about my unspeakable acts to fellow inmates, comparing myself to Ted Bundy. Fellow inmates testified against me, and I was again brought to trial. I was convicted for a second consecutive first-degree kidnapping charge for the kidnapping of 7-year-old Holly Ann Hughes 23 years prior. I've been linked with at least 6 victims, none of which have ever been found. All of their cases remain unsolved. I will be eligible for parole in 2037, when I will be 93 years old.
My name is Craig Price. I committed my first murder when I was 13. On July 27, 1987, I broke into a neighbor's home, took a knife from the kitchen, and stabbed 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer 58 times, killing her. 2 years later, on September 1st, 1989, I broke into another neighbor's home in Warwick, Rhode Island. After being discovered, I stabbed 39-year-old mother, Joan Heaton, 57 times, and then her 2 young daughters woke up. I stabbed Heaton's 10-year-old daughter, Jennifer, 62 times, and crushed the skull of 7-year-old Melissa. I was arrested 1 month before my 16th birthday, with police noting that I showed no remorse during my confession. I was tried and convicted as a minor, and was set to be released according to Rhode Island law when I turned 21. I bragged that I would make history when I was released. I've yet to be released, as I committed a series of assaults while in prison, adding to my original sentence. On January 2019, I was sentenced to an additional 25 years after stabbing a fellow inmate while in prison with a homemade knife. I remain the youngest American serial killer in history.
My name is Christopher Hightower. I murdered a family of 3 using a high-powered crossbow in 1993. I was a respected member of my community with a bright future ahead of me. I taught Sunday school, counseled troubled teens, and was a doctoral candidate in medicine before starting my own investment firm. On September 22, 1991, I shot lawyer Ernest Brendel with a crossbow using steel-tipped arrows. I then strangled his wife Emily and 8-year-old daughter Alice. Their remains were found in 2 shallow graves less than a mile from their home. I was arrested after I visited Mr. Brendel's sister and asked her for $75,000 to pay ransom to unidentified kidnappers of her brother's family. My actions shocked the quiet town of Barrington, Rhode Island, where I was well liked. While at trial, I tried to convince jurors that myself and the Brendel family were kidnapped by an Asian organized crime group, and that I had been forced to bury the bodies. The jury rejected this story, and I was sentenced to life in prison, without parole for the murders of Ernest, Alice, and Emily Brendel. It was revealed that I murdered Ernest and his family because he filed a complaint against me that could have led to me losing my license as an investment advisor.
My name is Edward Edwards. I murdered at least 5 people between 1977 and 1996. In 1955, I escaped from a jail in Akron, and by 1961, I was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. After being captured in 1962, I was paroled in 1967. claiming to have been reformed, I married and became a motivational speaker. The first murders that I was convicted of took place in 1977 in Ohio. Billy Lavaco, 21, and his girlfriend Judith Straub, 18, disappeared August 7, 1977. Straub's car was found in a parking lot with her purse and shoes still inside. Family members coordinated a search the next day. They found Lavaco and Straub lying on the ground, shot at point-blank range with a 20-gauge shotgun. My second pair of murders occurred in Concord, Wisconsin in 1980, when Tim Hack and Kelly Drew were stabbed and strangled. These became known as the Sweetheart Murders. Almost 29 years later, my connection to the crime was established by DNA testing. My own daughter, April, tipped off police about my possible involvement. I was arrested in 2009. I confessed to the 1996 murder of my foster son, 25-year-old Danny Boy Edwards. I killed Danny in a scheme to collect $250,000 of insurance money. I pled guilty to 5 murders and was sentenced to death in March 2011. I passed away a month later of natural causes, only months before I was scheduled to be executed. The exact number of my victims remains unknown.
My name is Fred West.
And I'm Rose West. We spread horror across Gloucester, England for 20 years between 1967 and 1987, taking the lives of at least 12 young women together. I first met Fred when I was 15 years. We began a relationship against the wishes of my family. While Fred was serving time in prison for stealing car tires, I murdered his daughter Charmaine from his previous marriage. I stowed her body in the coal cellar until Fred's release. He buried her in our backyard, keeping several small bones as a keepsake. After giving birth to our second child, I began working as a prostitute from our home. Fred and I explored increasingly violent and depraved fetishes with clients. By 1983, I had given birth to 8 children, at least 3 of whom were conceived by clients.
Our first murder, committed as a couple, took place in early 1973. Linda Gauff, 19, was a regular visitor to our home as a client. She eventually moved in with us before disappearing. Gauff's dismembered body was discovered underneath our garage. Her jaw was completely wrapped in adhesive and surgical tape to silence her screams.
After a string of murders, mostly targeting young women, we committed our final murder. Our daughter Heather, who had been the subject of abuse for most of her life, disappeared in 1987. We restrained her, assaulted her sexually, before I stomped her head in.
Police began a search following Heather's disappearance, before ultimately getting permission to excavate our backyard, where our unspeakable acts were discovered. I took my own life while awaiting trial in prison using an improvised rope.
In November 1995, I was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to 10 life terms in prison.
I am the Zodiac Killer. I claim to have killed 37 people and have never been identified. I spread terror across Northern California in the 1960s, specifically targeting young couples. My first confirmed victims were David Faraday and Betty Jensen on December 20, 1968. David and Betty were high school students on their first date. I approached them after they parked their car at a well-known lover's lane. I shot David in the back of the head before shooting Betty 5 times in the back as she fled. I sent letters taunting police to local newspapers, some including complex ciphers, threatening more killings if they weren't printed. I claimed I was collecting slaves for the afterlife. I claimed to have taken 37 lives, but the true number of my victims is unknown. Despite countless investigations by authorities and many suspects, I was never identified. I remain the most famous unsolved murder case in American history.
My name is Anthony Sowell. Between 2007 and 2009, I killed 11 black women in Cleveland, Ohio. In 1989, a woman who was 3 months pregnant attempted to leave my home. I bound her hands and feet with a tie and belt, then gagged her with a rag before trying to rape her. I pled guilty to attempted rape and served 15 years in prison before being released in 2005. I was evaluated 3 months after my release, with experts suggesting I was unlikely to harm women again. On October 27, 2009, police received a search warrant for my home after a woman reported having been bound with an extension cord and sexually assaulted until she passed out. Police entered my home and found 2 decomposing bodies. Further searches uncovered a total of 11 bodies. Some still fit into crawl spaces, and several buried in my backyard. Neighbors had complained about a terrible smell for years. On July 22, 2011, I was convicted for the murder of 11 women and sentenced to death. I spent the rest of my life on death row before passing away in February 2021 of an unspecified terminal illness. My former home on 12205 Imperial Avenue was demolished by the city. On November 6, 2021, a memorial to my victims, the Garden of 11 Angels, was dedicated. My heinous crimes drew national media attention and have inspired at least one copycat killer.
When it comes to true crime, the cases that interest me the most are robberies where no force is applied. So here's the story of a man who tricked Facebook and Google into giving him $100 million and didn't force them to do anything. So this guy named Evaldas basically set up a fake company in Latvia that was a same name as a company that both Google and Facebook worked with. And using the same name over the course of many years, he would create a bunch of fake invoices or receipts, basically bills that Google needed to pay to this company. And the crazy part is Google and Facebook, they didn't even do that much research. They just fucking paid them, I guess. And this guy stole like $100 million, and what he did is he laundered them throughout multiple bank accounts throughout Europe. And let's just say, I don't really know exactly what caused him to get caught, but once he did get caught, Google and Facebook both claimed to have gotten 100% of the money back, but I seriously doubt that. Honestly, I think that's not true. I think they're just really embarrassed that they paid this guy from Latvia $100 million without blinking an eye. And the dude, no one knows what happens to him yet, but he's getting at least like 20 years in prison, I think.
My name is Ted Bundy. As a young man, I was charming, intelligent, and had a promising future ahead of me. In my early 20s, I began to feel an overwhelming urge to harm women. I later described this as a force that was within me. I carried out my first documented unaliving in 1974, abducting 21-year-old college student Linda Ann Healy, and went on to unalive at least 36 young women over the next few years, though the exact number of my victims is unknown. Some experts suspect I began unaliving as a teenager. I would often approach my victims in public places, posing as an authority figure or using my good looks and charm to gain their trust. Despite being arrested several times, I managed to escape twice, which led to a massive manhunt. The police eventually caught up with me in Florida in 1978. It was revealed that I kept several of my victims' heads as sick trophies. During my trial, I represented myself, and despite my attempts to manipulate the court, I was ultimately convicted and executed in January 1989. My case remains possibly the most infamous example of serial unaliving in American history, and has provided insights into the psychology of a serial unaliver and the methods used to track them down.
My name is Kendall Francois. I unalived at least 8 women from 1996 to 1998 in Poughkeepsie, New York. After serving in the United States Army, I moved back to Poughkeepsie, New York, and got a job as a hall monitor at Arlington Middle School. I picked up Wendy Myers, a local sex worker, and my first known victim, on October 24th, 1996. I grabbed her throat and crushed it, leaving her to rot in my dilapidated attic. I continued targeting local sex workers, unaliving 29-year-old Gina Barone and Kathy Marsh, who was pregnant. Both of their bodies were found next to Wendy Myers in my attic. Perhaps most disturbingly, my parents and sister lived with me and had either dismissed the awful stench emanating from the attic or were too afraid to check. My last victim was 25-year-old Katina Newmaster in August 1998. Local police struggled to identify me as there were no crime scenes to examine, and my victims were all vulnerable members of society. I was caught in September 1998 after picking up a woman and trying to attack her in my car. The woman escaped, ran to a nearby gas station, and notified authorities. Authorities obtained a search warrant for my home and found the decomposed remains of the missing women. In August 2000, I was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to 8 counts of first-degree unaliving. I passed away while in prison at the age of 32 from an AIDS-related illness.
My name is Charles Starkweather. I unalived 11 people in Nebraska and Wyoming during an unaliving spree that lasted 2 months when I was 19 years old. I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. I was often bullied growing up, developing increasingly violent outbursts. My parents and family were even afraid to be around me by the time I dropped out of school. My first unaliving occurred in November 1957. I became enraged when Robert Culvert, a gas station attendant, refused to sell me a stuffed animal on credit. I robbed Robert, drove him to a remote area, and shot him in the head. On January 21st, 1958, I went to visit my girlfriend Carol at her home. I was confronted by her mother and stepfather, Velda and Mario Bartlett, who told me to stay away from Carol. I shot them both, then unalived their 2-year-old daughter, Betty Jean, by clubbing her. Carol and I went on a 2-month-long unaliving spree across Nebraska and Wyoming. My last victim was traveling salesman Merle Collison. Carol and I needed a new car after abandoning our previous vehicle and came upon Merle sleeping in his Buick. I shot him and stole his car. I was caught on January 29, 1958, after a police chase and shootout and sentenced to be unalived. I was unalived by electric chair on June 25, 1959 at the age of 20. Carol Fugate, my girlfriend, who was present for every unaliving, served 17 years in prison before being released in 1976. My actions became one of the early crime scandals to rise to national prominence, receiving significant press coverage.
My name is Angel Maturino Resendiz, but you probably know me as the Railroad Unaliver. I'm suspected of having unalived as many as 23 people across the United States and Mexico between 1986 and 1999. During my 13-year unaliving spree, I would travel the country by illegally train hopping. I would unalive victims in their homes with rocks, a pickaxe, and other blunt objects. I would then linger in their homes for a while, eating their food, taking sentimental items, and learning more about their lives. Most of my victims lived near train tracks, which is why I became known as the Railroad Unaliver. My sister saw my FBI Most Wanted poster and contacted authorities after I'd been deported back to Mexico. I surrendered myself to the U.S. Border Patrol and was tried and sentenced to be unalived for the unaliving of 39-year-old pediatric neurologist Claudia Benton in 1998. I told a neuropsychologist that God told me to unalive all of my victims and that I was an eternal being, half man, half angel. Despite some concerns about my mental state, I was unalived on June 27, 2006 in Huntsville, Texas.
One of the scariest serial killers to me is one you probably haven't heard of. His name is Karl Denke, and he was a German serial killer, as you could tell from the mustache. So this guy's victims of choice were often homeless people or poor travelers. And because this happened in the 1860s, surveillance wasn't around. So once someone traveled from one city to another, it was pretty common to not hear back from them for a really long time. So as this person was picking them off, a lot of them went undiscovered. However, the scary part is what he did after unaliving them. He would take their flesh and sell it at the local market and advertise it as pork. And people oftentimes bought their meat and ate it. And the way he was caught was also rather interesting. So Denke was actually a really well-regarded person within his community, and because of that, no one ever suspected him. One day, he offered a homeless person $20, I'm not sure what the currency was at the time, to write a letter on behalf of him, because I'm assuming he said he couldn't write or something. And then he got a pickaxe and tried to unalive that homeless person. However, the homeless person survived and ran outside of the house. But the police didn't believe the homeless person. They actually ended up arresting the homeless person for panhandling. Luckily enough, though, the judge insisted that this guy's crimes were to be investigated. And because of that, he was taken to a holding cell where he unalived himself with a rope. This amateur pilot, named Frederick Valentich, probably has some of the most chilling last words you've ever heard. Before his aircraft presumably plummeted into the ocean, his last words were, "Wait, that's not an aircraft." Which probably doesn't sound that strange or scary, but once you hear his story, maybe it'll change your mind. So this guy was an amateur pilot, meaning that he was trying to become a commercial pilot. He'd already been rejected from the Air Force, and he really wanted a career in aviation, but he wasn't a good pilot. On top of wanting to be a pilot, he also really liked UFOs. So he was flying a plane similar to this one over the ocean. Not too long into the flight, he reported to air traffic control that there was another plane 4,500 feet above him, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He only saw 4 landing lights, as well as a weird metallic shape. Weirdly enough though, air traffic control said there was no planes at that altitude and there was no planes near him. And that's when he radioed back his last words, "Wait, it isn't an aircraft." There's a few theories as to what could have happened. The first one is maybe he tried to unalive himself. That's probably not too likely considering he radioed into air traffic control. Another one was he might have been flying upside down, so he confused part of his own plane as that UFO. But the last one is that he was just shot down by a UFO. Who knows?
My name is Carol Cole. I committed my first unaliving when I was 8 years old. I was plagued by a fantasy of strangling women throughout my early life, spending time in mental hospitals and prison. My first victim as an adult was Essie Louise Buck. I picked her up at a tavern in San Diego in May 1971 before strangling her in my car. I continued on a streak of unalivings, targeting women in California and Nevada before returning to Dallas. While back in Dallas, I went on an unaliving spree, strangling 3 women in November 1980. Police considered me a suspect in the first 2 unalivings, and I was on the scene at the third. I was arrested and held in custody. Police came to the conclusion my final victim likely passed away as a result of natural causes, and were about to rule me out as a suspect before I confessed to all 3 unalivings, and at least 11 more, though I had lost count. I was convicted of 3 unalivings, committed in Texas on April 9, 1981, and sentenced to life in prison. I agreed to face further charges for my unalivings in Nevada, and was sentenced to be unalived in Nevada. I was unalived by injection on December 6, 1985. It is believed I may have taken as many as 35 lives, but the true number is unknown to this day.